Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar. Today, this is our TrialX webinar series where we put a spotlight on emerging trends in clinical trials. In our last webinar, we discussed strategies to increase diversity in clinical trials. Today, we'll be talking about the future of decentralized clinical trials. In past couple years, we have seen advent of commercial space flight, which is opening up avenues for more health research in space. And simultaneously, there has been a greater adoption of decentralized research in clinical trials world. So we'll discuss what are the implications of commercial space missions and research being done by civilian astronauts and what that can mean for decentralized clinical trials on Earth. And to discuss that, today we have some esteemed guests on our webinar who will put more light on the topic. So we'll start with some introductions. So with us, we have Jimmy Wu. He's a senior biomedical engineer at the Translational Research Institute for Space Health. He leads and manages biomedical research to be conducted on commercial spaceflight missions. He's also a faculty member at Baylor College of Medicine's Center for Space Medicine. Previously, Jimmy worked at the NASA Johnson Space Center for 14 years on engineering, integration, operations, and R&D. So welcome, Jimmy.
Thank you.
Next, we have Kathy Johnson Throop, who is a space health data system consultant. She worked for 14 years at NASA as an enterprise architect and branch chief for the Information Systems Architecture branch. She also served as an assistant professor in the School of Health Informatics at the University of Texas Health Sciences Center. Welcome, Kathy.
Thank you.
And next, we have Kimberly Jenkins. She is a research administrator at the Center for Clinical Research at the Cleveland Clinic, focusing on endocrine and metabolism clinical research. She began her career in clinical research in 2003 at the Columbia University's Herbert Irving Comprehensive Cancer Center, where she managed the adult and pediatric hematology and oncology research programs. Welcome, Kim.
Thank you. So happy to be here.
Finally, thank you. And finally, we have Sharib Khan, who is the co-founder and CEO of TrialX, and also the chief commercial astronaut in waiting, as you will see. He's also a huge space enthusiast and passionate about application of computers in advancing healthcare and clinical research. Sharib holds a master's in biomedical informatics from Columbia University and an MD from the University of Medical Sciences from Delhi University. Welcome, Sharib. So before we get into this, just one quick logistic question. There is a question box that you will see. There's an ask a question button on your screen. You should see on top right. So we'll ask you to add your questions in that, and we'll answer to them and send them to panelists as we go along. And finally, we have Q&A sessions, dedicated Q&A sessions. So please send in your questions as they come. So Sharib, anything else you want to add?
Yeah, Chintan, thank you for all the introductions. And folks, we're very excited about this webinar today. As Chintan laid the groundwork, we have Jimmy and Kathy representing space health research with decades of experience. We have Kimberly Blosey here representing all the experience she has running clinical trials here on Earth. We still are doing clinical trials on Earth. We still haven't gone to all space research. And why we put this topic, folks, today is that it's a great time to be involved with clinical research, and with all the changes that came up in clinical research during the pandemic, and accelerated shift to virtual clinical technologies for support clinical research. And in the meantime, we also have seen the advent of commercial spaceflight, which Jimmy is going to kick off talking about. And I just think that there's just a lot that we can learn from commercial space missions and see if that can help translate in terms of tools, technologies, processes that can enable greater adoption of clinical trials here in the decentralized mode, and further, even in getting into clinical care. Can these technologies help patients track their health better? Can these technologies open up patients becoming more involved in their healthcare? So that's why we are here today. And Chintan, let's get the conversation started. Looking forward to a great conversation for the next 50 minutes or so.
Thank you, Sharib, for that background. So we'll start with with Jimmy. So Jimmy, can you tell our audience about the state of commercial space flights since the launch of Inspiration 4 and what it means for space health research?
Yeah, so what was really unique about the Inspiration 4 launch, it was the first all-private orbital commercial spaceflight mission. And it really kicked off, I think, throughout that year, a few companies space launch providing companies that were starting their maiden journeys with commercial astronauts. And so we did have a couple other companies that were doing suborbital flights, which is a bit different, a bit more technically different than doing orbital flights. And so those, not to take away a claim from those companies, but those missions were of just shorter duration, minutes versus days that we're talking about with orbital missions. And so your exposure to spaceflight is much different. But what has transpired since Inspiration 4 is now a continue basically pipeline of private individuals going to space to experience it. And what's unique about this demographic is these are folks that are from the general population. With our public astronauts, or I call maybe government-sponsored astronauts, these are individuals that are pretty much selected into their respective nation's astronaut corps. And so there's a pretty stringent requirement for their fitness, for their health status. And so a lot of pre-existing conditions that are pretty common on Earth are actually not, are usually screened out with professional astronauts, with government-sponsored astronauts. And so what becomes really interesting is with commercial spaceflight astronauts, you're talking about more of the general population being able to fly. We've seen young astronauts fly. We've seen old astronauts fly. We've seen with Haley Arsenault here during Inspiration 4, the first cancer patient, and also a first astronaut with a prosthesis go into space. So you're starting to see a more democratized set of individuals going into space. And as such, we also start seeing a different profile of health conditions that will go into space. Instead of a lot of these pre-existing conditions being screened out, they are now maybe part of the actual population that goes into space. And so this is what's really interesting is we don't have a lot of data on what some of those pre-existing conditions may manifest in spaceflight. So conditions such as diabetes or cardiovascular disease, normally screened out with our professional astronauts, but obviously very common in the general population. We have zero data on how those conditions manifest in spaceflight. So this is really a unique opportunity to start collecting data on these early pioneers, and it's just to see what happens as we get more individuals going into space and getting exposed to the hazards of spaceflight, such as zero gravity, radiation exposure, isolation from Earth. When you're that far away from friends and family, while you may see the planet below you, you're not necessarily connected to them as you would be, if we were all on the surface. So, I think that's, I think what we see, and you saw some of the slides there with regards to the next core of individuals going into space. And so it's very exciting times. And I encourage everyone to, follow what these missions are doing and what their plans are, because I think they're they have really impressive missions, goals that they have in mind that will continue to advance access to spaceflight for the general population.
Thank you, Jimmy. Can you highlight some of the top priorities on space health research? What are the top, priorities that we, have from a science perspective? What are the things that we are trying to learn, and how is your work supporting that?
Yeah, sure. So this is, I think this is an interesting question, because I think it depends on which population that we're talking about here. And so, as I referred to earlier, we kind of have a public government sponsored cohort of the astronaut corps, and then we have the private commercial spaceflight participants, astronauts here. And so the mission for these different groups is different. And what we're trying to understand is, like, for example, NASA with the US astronauts, they have a different set of risks to spaceflight that they're trying to address. And most of these risks are based on how the mission that NASA has assigned, which right now is to return back to the moon, and then the eventual further exploration of our solar system beyond the moon. And so that's a really different exposure profile than our private astronauts, our commercial astronauts that are orbiting Earth and low Earth orbit. And so so they have a different set of risks that they're trying to understand than the commercial astronauts. And so, but in general, what we're really looking for is do our basic physiological systems, how do they adapt to space flight? Or do they respond in a positive way? Do they respond in a negative way? For the most part, there is some adaptation going on. So this is, both with the cardiovascular side, the musculoskeletal, the central nervous system, all the systems that we have on Earth are all affected. And so we're really trying to understand how those changes, in many cases, we actually understand how their negative effects are, but we're also trying to push the envelope to try to develop countermeasures to deal with some of these negative effects. So for example, sensory motor adaptation to spaceflight, right? When you go into space, you lose your sense of up and down because of the lack of gravity. So that's a very, that's a very poignant change when you go into space flight. And that loss of up and down can be very disorienting to individuals, especially if your neurovestibular system is not well adapted to those changes. And this can affect your experience in space, right? So, I think we've all done this with, like, if somebody gets seasick or car sick, motion sick, right? It really puts a downer on your day or at that particular moment. So if you can imagine, for professional astronauts, you don't want to be sick for a few days because you're going to space. You've got important things to do in space flight, such as maybe doing a spacewalk or repairing equipment. So, you don't want to be debilitated in any way. And then on the commercial side, depending on why you're going, it may be you're going for leisure. And maybe you're going for some other, purpose, maybe scientific or whatever, right? Well, you don't want to have that downtime again because your journey is going to be pretty short, since the missions, that commercial missions we're seeing right now are anywhere from 3 to 10 days. And so you don't want to really miss any of that. It's just like going on a nice big vacation on our end, and then you get sick and you lose some days, right? And so understanding, for example, what happens to your sensory motor system will allow us to be able to test some countermeasures that can either help deal with mitigating the effects if you get sick, or maybe in some cases predict if you may get sick in spaceflight, so that we can specialize the treatment options or the preventative options that can prevent you from getting sick in the first place.
Yeah, thank you, Jimmy. This sounds very, very exciting, and looks like within reach, right? We used to read about all these things in sci-fi, and now, we are preparing for the humanity to go to space. So very exciting work you described. So going back, as we were talking, what happened since till now. So let's ask Kathy. So Kathy, now that we have all these commercial space missions that are being planned, and I know you did a lot of work at NASA. So how do you see that the space health research has evolved from what it was being done when you were at NASA?
So Jimmy highlighted a lot of this in his talk, but I'll hit some highlights again just to hit them home. So certainly the diversity and number of subjects increase. With these shorter missions with 4 to 6 subjects each time, we wind up with a lot more people flying, and we wind up with younger people, older people, and people who have existing medical conditions, which is not something we often have with the NASA astronauts. In addition to that, the technology that's available to gather data is also a big factor. It's able to collect a lot more data non-invasively than ever before. And of course, NASA's going in this direction too, but it's a change in our environment. So the volume of data increases in both the number of subjects and the number of data types and the data points available for analysis. That's huge. And then on top of that, as he also mentioned, the research topics are evolving, and especially when it comes to commercial flight, because the goals are a little bit different. So maybe there's a little bit more focus on collecting a standardized set of data across all missions to better understand the typical changes to people who fly in space, what those changes might predict about longer missions, and maybe what could help the space flyers to accommodate the changes that are problematic. As Jimmy mentioned, you don't want to be throwing up in the, if you only have a 4-day mission, you don't want to spend 3 days throwing up. So there's a lot to be done there to really understand how this diverse range of subjects are reacting to space flight.
Yeah, no, I think that's important to really, make sure that, the health is a priority. So now maybe we
they're spending, multi-million-dollar trips. We want to give them a good consumer experience as well. I'm assuming, Kathy and Jimmy, that it's evolving towards that experience that this space travel brings. But Chintan, please continue. Yeah.
Yeah, so now, let's come down back to the Earth. So we heard how it's going on with space. Now, coming back to the Earth, I'd like to ask Kim, can you explain our listeners some of the research processes that are happening in clinical trial and how it's, decentralized trials approach with virtual at-home visits, patients reported outcomes. So can you highlight some of the work that you are seeing on the ground from your research experience?
Sure, certainly. Let's see, I'll start by saying I think space is the ultimate decentralized trial platform, but decentralized, aspects of decentralized trials have been happening here on Earth for over a decade. Patients, can enter into a cell phone or a tablet, their symptoms, and that immediately ports into the master database, for example. We've had e-consent for about 10 years now, DocuSign, if it's IRB approved and there's certain security measures in place, patients can sign a consent on their phone or on their computer. And that's, part of our research process. And it's been so for many years. More and more so technology is infiltrating our medical practices and therefore our clinical trials as well. So you can see devices here like saliva collection kits. Patients can bring home, collect some saliva samples, mail them back in. There's a Bluetooth scale pictured there. We use that a lot. I'm part of the Endocrine and Metabolism Institute at the Cleveland Clinic. So we're monitoring patients' weight and health all the time. Health trackers, Fitbits. Pictured there is what's called an InPen. It's a Bluetooth insulin injectable pen that monitors the time, date, and the amount of insulin that's injected, and again goes to an app and then ports over to the medical record as well. So these are aspects of what decentralized trials might feel like. Actually, can you stay in that last slide? Sorry, Chintan. A lot of what's also becoming more and more involved is the shipping of drugs to patients, the shipping of devices to patients. They receive them, use them at home, and ship them back. So it does put the onus on patients to properly use this technology, properly hook it up, properly get the app on their phone working, and properly send things back when they need to. So now let's go to the next slide. So I can share a little bit here that decentralized trials have been growing. If you look at any graph, it's only growing, over the last 10 years, but I wanted to focus on this one in particular. This is from PPD. PPD is a very large clinical research organization that helps coordinate many types of clinical trials here in the United States and abroad as well. Since COVID, that has really forced Earth-based clinical trials to become decentralized because for a whole year, many patients couldn't participate in clinical trials. So, we had to rapidly adapt to technologies, telehealth visits, shipping and receiving of things through mail. But it particularly, COVID kickstarted things or really boosted things quite a bit, and it's still continuing. So just in between March and June of 2021, the adoption of electronic consent, remote data capture, telehealth visits, home health visits, and direct to patient supply has rapidly increased. So that's only growing more and more.
Thank you, Kim. And I can add, folks here, that we have seen in the last 4 or 5 years that we have been dabbling with mobile technologies to support clinical research data collection, starting way back in 2017, when Apple had launched a research kit. We built an app called America Walks, which was the first demonstration of a cross-compatible iOS as well as Android app for measuring how many steps an average American walks in a day. And it was a great experience. And since then, we have seen university researchers use these apps to track, how much time people are spending indoor versus outdoor. We had this great study out of Biomedical College of Wisconsin. They just wanted to see sun exposure and calculate, some proxy for vitamin D exposure, and just use the app for tracking indoor-outdoor location coverage. Then there are apps to track medication adherence for patients who have had amputations at Northwestern University. Are they taking their medications? Are they being able to move around as expected? So symptom tracker apps for Columbia University's endometriosis Fendo app, a whole research randomized clinical trial for smoking cessation intervention using a mobile app. So we have seen a lot of interest in the last 3 to 4 years, and as the industry itself has also been moving to greater adoption of mobile, tablet, and do-it-yourself or home-based technologies or processes to support patients in their research journey. Very exciting times, and I feel that we are right at the cusp that in the next 5 to 10 years, and some of the technologies that are being used in space missions could make monitoring even much more easier and accessible, so that this can be at the population level for general healthcare monitoring, general self-care that patients can or people can engage with. But I'll save that for later discussion. Chintan, back to you.
Yeah, thank you, Kim. Thank you, Sharib, for laying out what has happened with the rise of electronic technologies and how it has been changing how clinical trials are conducted. I know it was a big shift with COVID, and we have seen a huge influx of remote data collection technologies into the space. So with that, let's learn what is being used in the space side to collect such remote data, because it's the ultimate remote. So Jimmy, can you help us understand what are some of the new devices or technologies that are being used in the space health research data collection?
Sure, Chintan. Thank you for that question. I think, as Kim said, I think it's really great that the clinical trial industry has evolved and had to deal with this disrupting factor of COVID, and that really, in many ways, as you said, is very analogous to space flight and our remoteness, our lack of infrastructure. So, all the infrastructure that's currently in place that allows for Earth-based clinical trials to happen is really just based on supply chain and logistics, and also some data telecommunications infrastructure that you guys have in place. Well, that doesn't exist in space. We have to bring it with us, and we have to build it slowly over time. And so what happens really when you go into space is we start getting to this sort of theoretical problem called the backpack problem. Is like, what do you take with you? And so you only have the vehicle's only so big, it has a certain amount of power. The crew going with them have only a certain amount of training and expertise. And so how do you best manage that? And in many ways, a lot of what we do in spaceflight, we hope can serve as a forcing function for maybe as technology evolves and becomes easier to use, that it also can be applied in Earth-based clinical trials as well. And so this comes down to devices that allow for easy acquisition of physiological parameters, such as heart rate, blood pressure, all the usual stuff you would get going to a doctor's office. Can we get that remotely without having to go to a specific facility? So it basically becomes, as the point of this webinar, is it's decentralized. It can be done anywhere. And you have it in a form factor that's really easy to use. It's attractive. People want to wear it, want to use it. There's compliance associated with it. So you've got your Garmin watch here. You've got your Apple Watch. These are great form factors to be able to collect passive, unobtrusive physiological data. One of the really amazing advances over the last few years is on the ultrasound front. And as you know, those of you, if you're familiar with ultrasound, you typically see kind of a cart rack-sized device that gets carted into the room when you're at the doctor's office or you're at the hospital, and it's about the size of a large laptop, and a lot of buttons on there. You don't know what they do, so you have to have a lot of training associated with being able to operate a device like that. And then, like I said, you just got a larger form factor. Well, there's been tremendous advancements in that technology sector, where now we've got a company like Butterfly Network that's developed a handheld ultrasound probe that connects to a smart device platform, whether it's a phone or a tablet. And so now you've got the ability to do ultrasound literally in a physician's pocket. And the cost of a device like this has diminished greatly as well. And its ease of use has also become a lot simpler. Instead of a whole keyboard of buttons in terms of what to do, it's now much more simplified. Software associated with operating the device has been redesigned so that someone that's less trained on it would be able to operate it. They now, because now they're computational platforms, are starting to apply artificial intelligence algorithms to help with the analysis of data. So there's quite a bit of advancements in technology that has really only come up in the last 5 years, starting to be applied and brought out to the commercial market. And so these are just, again, 2 examples, I feel, of diagnostic equipment that basically collects data off of a subject that now you're starting to see less and less need for going to a centralized location, having very trained individuals operate those devices. And what we've seen with the Inspiration 4 mission and the other hopefully future commercial space, but it's part of Trish's portfolio, is having the crews, as you can see here with Anna Menon, actually being trained on use of ultrasound, and they're wearing smartwatch platforms to collect their physiological data. So we're already starting to deploy these technologies. They've gotten to the point where they can be decentralized and given to non-expert operators to be able to collect high quality data.
So Jimmy, just on follow up on this, now when you are training these commercial astronauts to do these, use these devices themselves, can you cite some examples on the challenges you faced in training, or even when they were in the space flight? What were some obstacles they had, and can you cite some examples on what happened there?
Yeah. So I think a lot of these challenges I've described will actually be probably relevant to the home decentralized clinical trial arena as well. One of the biggest ones is, despite even getting the pre-flight training, there's always sort of a skill retention gap, right? Like, you got trained on how to do this one procedure. Like, so I don't know if you guys are mechanics. I'm just going to use an example, like repairing your car, right? Like, some of us, we just typically just take it to a mechanic or a dealership and it gets taken care of, right? But some of us may or may not remember how to change the oil on it. Yeah, you've probably seen it before, kind of have to understand the concepts of it. But like when someone actually asks you to do it, it could be a challenge unless you've done it many, many times. And so I think that's one of the challenges we have with, despite the advancements in the technology, is there's still a skill retention, right? It's not the hardware that's the problem, it's the soft products that are a problem. And so it's how do we now provide either in a very easy way to ingest by the operator, refresher training, to maybe continually to update their skills as it goes along, as you go along with their mission, or just-in-time training where it's, I didn't have a refresher recently. Can I get just-in-time instruction on what to do, what button to push, how to make a decision when I'm at a decision branch, and then to be able to iterate and continue down the progression of what I'm supposed to do until I get the desired results, outputs. So I think there's still a lot of work to be done there, a lot of research, and I think we have a lot of investigators that are really interested in that. But I think this is relevant to the decentralized clinical trial sector as well, because I imagine the first few data points in a clinical trial for a subject that hasn't done this particular exam many times is probably not as relevant, because the operator, the subject probably is just not as familiar with it. So it takes a little bit of time to just learn what you're supposed to do. And so it becomes it becomes an interesting approach. Do you just make the devices easier to use, right? That's one approach. Or two, do you supplement the technology because there isn't a simplification of it with better instruction that can provide either refresher training or just-in-time training?
No, that's excellent. And Kathy, do you have any comment on how NASA used to do this training and with how it happened back then?
Sure. So there were some slides in there that showed some of the training. So we would train on the ground by hand. We would also train in flight on something that would do suborbital, sometimes called the vomit comet. But anyway, so we would do training where they had episodes of microgravity. One more slide, you'll see that. So you see them flying around in the back of a plane. It's a great way. Things operate really differently in microgravity. So you need a little bit of experience there if you can get it. However, the other thing that we did was just to train and train and train. So the devices were not always easy to use. And so you had to execute it several times, and you would train sometimes a long time before the mission. And then we would have to try to figure out how to squeeze in refresher training, as Jimmy hit a lot of this already, but to reiterate, there was a lot of training. Many hours of training went into using every device. In fact, it was part of what we would evaluate when we were trying to figure out which research experiments could fly, is how much training time did they need in order to be able to do the research experiment, and could we fit that all in? So I think we have a wonderful opportunity here. So as we move to devices and methods that are just so much easier and generate quality data, it can really decrease the training required. And that opens up the possibilities for the research that we can do. It's just absolutely amazing. There is a potential trade-off with data quality if the methods don't work well. But all that means is we need to evaluate those methods before flight so we don't lose the in-flight data that is really so darned expensive to obtain. So you try it out, you make sure that you have a good understanding, and you try to break it, okay? So don't use people that are just always compliant. Use people who don't necessarily know how to do this, or who are actually pushing the edges and trying to break the system. And then harden your procedures. So again, you want to make it so that they have an easy to use device, they have a procedure that's pretty much foolproof, and you want to provide as much as possible just-in-time prompts and cues that help them work through that process. That way you get the best data quality possible. Now, all of that really still applies to all of those clinical trials on Earth. It's the same thing. You're just looking at getting people to collect their own data. And so keys are, again, reiterating, easy to use devices, easy to use protocols, and you've hardened them, you've anticipated the problems, and you know the workarounds, and you educate them a little bit about why it's important to do it this way so that they don't try to go their own way. Well, they told me to do it that way. I'll just do it. No, you need to do it the way we described so that we get the best data possible. So that's it. There's a lot there, and it's a lot the same.
No, that's a great point, Kathy. A lot of training, and there's a trade-off with data quality. But Kim, do you have something to add? Do you think patients could use a handheld ultrasound probe like this in one of your research studies?
Yeah, I in fact really like what Kathy said, that you can enroll, and you're screening for patients who want to do the research, right? So they're interested, they have an interest to do it. And they're somewhat tech savvy. You don't want someone who's totally foreign to tech and freaked out and, banging on a button just to get something to work. You want kind of an average user, who has some kind of common sense about them. And we often give patients on our trials, I think probably too much, but lots of logs to refer back to, lots of training pamphlets and materials to open back up with step-by-step instructions for how to do things. So I do think it's very similar. I will say, I think astronauts, especially thinking of the Inspiration 4 crew, they were all kind of science-minded. I think, what's her name, Haley, she was a nurse practitioner. They all had a kind of bit of science background. And I think some of our patients do and some of our patients don't. So I think the rigor that the astronauts have, using the technology, conducting science experiments in space is going to be on a higher level, I think, than just civilians down on Earth. But where there's a will, there's a way. We're running a trial right now that's 100% decentralized, lots of technology, lots of devices, and patients are nailing it. And it's because they're interested. They're passionate about it. They want to put the time in. It's an intensive trial, and they're getting fantastic results. So
that's amazing. Well, Jimmy, just out of curiosity, can you tell us, our audience, and what's going on here? What is Jared learning to do here?
So this looks like a device to measure interocular pressure. So there's, for those that aren't familiar with eye anatomy, the bulk of your eye is, there's a fluid in there. And so that fluid has a certain pressure associated with it. And so this device is looking to measure what that pressure is. And the reason that's important is, as you can probably read by the caption here, there's a syndrome that was discovered in the last 15 years. Because we actually started flying longer in space. We actually didn't see this during shorter duration space flights, but during longer duration space flights, we started seeing this a suite of symptoms, a suite of conditions that we're still trying to understand what's causing it. But we've kind of lumped it into this one generic name called spaceflight associated neuroocular syndrome, or SANS. And so it's basically a syndrome that affects the central nervous system, so your brain, and your eyes. And then, as you know, between the eyes and the brain, there's an ocular nerve that connects it. And so we're trying to understand the relationship of the pressure of the fluids in the central nervous system, which is called cerebral spinal fluid. And in this case, and then also the fluid of the eye. And so we're trying to see what that pressure is, and then the nerve in between. And so what this study is looking at is measuring the interocular pressure. And then we have other studies on the Polaris Dawn missions looking to also look at the cerebral spinal fluid pressure, which is called intracranial pressure, or ICP. And so hopefully we can find a relationship between those two pressures to help better understand SANS.
That's so cool, so cool. And I'm hoping I can do these ultrasounds and, for self-care and, hopefully get a handle of this device soon. Chintan, what's next?
Yeah, so thank you, Kathy, about the tips, and Kim, how these things can be improved. And just to summarize, it's a lot about education, behavior, making patient adhere to these things, and we have seen this a lot in clinical trials world over the past decades, right? Having patient adherence, even in healthcare, it's a big challenge, and you can only do so much, right? So those all things apply. So now going into what's happening these days. So Jimmy, with this expand database that Trish is building, the open research database, do you want to talk about it, how this database is going to push the envelope of space health research?
Yeah, I would love to. When you think about Earth-based clinical trials, right? Typically you're talking about ends of thousands of individuals, so that you have a large data set. You can really find out, is there a real signal in the data, or is it just a small sample size, and it's not necessarily statistically relevant. So this in spaceflight is a huge problem, because our ends are really, really low. If you look at just the number of humans that have ever been in space since we started going, since Yuri Gagarin went into space, it is around 624 individuals. That's 60 years of human spaceflight, only 600 people, 600 plus people. So our ends are extremely low when you compare to the power that you need with that you see on Earth-based clinical trials. And so what we're trying to do with the expand database is, kind of bear with me as I kind of go through the sequence of what we're trying to do here, is the hope of commercial spaceflight is, again, sort of the democratization and decentralization of access of the general population of spaceflight. And with that opening up, we now have a larger population that has potential opportunity to go into space. And we're starting to see that with these commercial spaceflight missions coming up, both orbital and suborbital. And so we have a potential for a significant increase in the amount of individuals in N that could participate in space-based biomedical research. And so what we're doing here at Trish is really taking the opportunity to collect the data on these individuals, these early pioneers that we had an opportunity. They were really interested and motivated, kind of talking to what Kim and Kathy were talking about earlier with ground-based, earth-based trials, right? You want individuals that are very motivated and empowered in their own healthcare and providing this data. And so we're really kind of tapping into that motivation and that mission that these individuals have, and try to collect the data sets that we feel will be very important for understanding human spaceflight going forward. And like I said, since we're now having the general population fly, we're starting to collect data on individuals that have pre-existing conditions that we have no data on right now. Now, we don't know if any of these have any harmful effects in spaceflight because, again, the exposures are low and we have a low number, right? But eventually, as more and more people go into space, what happens if we start seeing a cohort of diabetes patients in spaceflight starting to have these certain conditions or diseases manifest? Well, the point of the expand database is maybe we can look back, this is 10, 15 years down the line, but we can now look back over the many years of participants in spaceflight and look at their data. It's like, hey, were we seeing this before, or was it there before, but we just didn't know about it because we didn't know what we didn't know. We didn't know what was going to happen to these individuals with pre-existing conditions when they go into space. And so the hope is this database can serve as that repository. We provide the incentive and the motivation for our participants to provide and consent and participate in these studies. And then, we store this data. And like as you see on this slide, we've got not just the clinical records, but we're hoping to do biosamples as well. We're collecting blood, saliva, urine. We're collecting ultrasound, getting some non-invasive imaging to look at the anatomy. We're doing omics analysis, like full genomic, proteomic analysis on samples that we've collected. We do questionnaires and surveys. We collect all the wearable data that we've talked about before. And obviously we're looking at some eye stuff, but another beauty of it too is we're also collecting environmental data on the mission. So this is the environment that the mission is going through. So where were they on orbit of the Earth? What was their altitude? What was their exposure to radiation? What was their carbon dioxide and nitrogen levels? These are all environmental things. What time of day did they collect this data? Is it in the morning? Is it in the afternoon? Because as you think about going to space, there's not your typical 24-hour day-night cycle, right? You're going around, you're getting orbiting the planet every 90 minutes. Your day-night cycle and circadian rhythm is disrupted, right? So all these are confounders in terms of how your body adapts to being in space. And so we know this because of NASA's history, but now what we don't know is how it applies to the general population versus a select astronaut corps. So this is stuff that is just interesting data, and we're hope that what we're trying to do with Expand Database is start collecting it on these early pioneer astronauts that are going, and then hopefully there's a space rush, like literally hundreds of people going to space, and we are exponentially populating this database as quickly as possible. And it could be a really impressive data, a trove of data for future research as we really try to help humanity thrive and explore space.
Oh, that's amazing, Jimmy. And as you're seeing in the database, to me, this is very exciting, the initiative that Trish is supporting, because this data, as you said, we can look back at it later with a new, fresh pair of eyes when we have new ways to look at the data. And that's amazing. And I feel this is a new model of how we could also collect data from different studies here on Earth, and then be able to look back at it or give access to other researchers who are not involved in this data collection to better understand and help accelerate the understanding and the disease pathology or the treatment options that could be developed from this data. So, Chintan, anything else you would like to add about this data, and especially the environmental information that's going in here?
Yeah, so I think Jimmy, what you highlighted is the type of data, diversity of data that this database is going to house. So ranging from clinical records to genomics to so it can range from few kilobytes to petabytes as it gets collected, and with this goal of making it available across number of years, like decade. How do you model it and how do you design it? And I think that's a big task, and I think this database is building the founding blocks of it. And
yeah, and Yeah, Janet, if I could add, I think that's a really good point in terms of, if you kind of look at this infographic here about the different types and data types that we have here, different sizes. You know, when we start talking about decentralizing a lot of this, and when you're talking about having the person at home be able to collect this data, knowing that you have very simple, maybe, the survey data, which is going to be, alphanumeric data, right? Very simple, very lean, not a whole lot of complexity there, into, imaging data, into genomic data, right? Very complex, very data dense. So I think it's really important to kind of highlight just that data diversity and how to manage it, and the infrastructure that the TrialX team here is putting in place to help understand how can we be more efficient in this, because this, as we go further away from Earth, or the clinical trials start to get into the home, there's complexity there too. It's not just kind of what we talked about before in terms of making the devices easy to use and making them reliable. I mean, that's its own contributing factor to advancing clinical trials. But the data density and the data variety is also important to not trivialize, because that needs to go somewhere. And so how you manage it getting from source to destination is something that it's not front and center a lot of times. But I think as we start seeing the wealth of data that's being collected, I think people are starting to uncover there are challenges and risks there that we need to try to address and learn from. And so we're hoping using spaceflight for the same reason. What can we learn about the data diversity there, and what tools and optimization plans can we put in place to help manage that as it comes back to Earth?
Thank you, Jimmy. And
No,
Kath, yeah, please add, how is this different from having data at NASA? And any comments about this database?
Well, the comment I was going to add was a lesson that we learned in spades at NASA, which is to make sure you understand the context of the data collection. Because when you go to look at this a year, 2, 10, 30 years later, as we've been trying to do with the NASA data, if you don't know whether that particular data set was a trial run or an actual run, how it fit in the timeline, if you haven't captured that metadata about the data, and especially with wearables, when you're wearing them all the time, you have to know how that fits in the context of the rest of the data. So that's a really important piece, and the Expand database is being designed to hold all of that context and to be able to marry those things together. So that's really important. I'll bring that lesson forward.
Any quick thoughts on how data across your trials is being put together or being reused, or looking across studies to see larger patterns?
Certainly, big data is a trend right now. So, comparing millions of patients across university hubs is happening more and more. There's renowned, registry databases housed at various academic centers that people go to, and we set up data use agreements to share that data. So that's certainly a very valuable resource that our universities are taking advantage of. One comment I also wanted to add is we have found success with a very simple one-page consent form where every patient that walks in the door, of a certain subgroup that we're looking for, consent, we get some blood tubes or get some data to collect, and they go to our registry that we can then use for larger, national, multinational trials. So hopefully the space rush that does happen, everyone will get a consent, agree to have data collected, and we can use this data to further deepen our understanding of human life in space.
Kim, would you volunteer to be a space health research subject, a participant?
If my daughter can come, yes, absolutely. She's 3, so I will volunteer her to go.
Oh, you never know. It could be, you could be the Robinsons, right? You could have your spring break in space.
Totally. I'm down.
Great. Chintan, any?
Yes, so we're coming down to the hour now. So, I think just now looking forward into the future, what's going to happen. So, Jimmy, we know like NASA is now doing the Artemis mission, and incidentally, it's going into space on November 14th. So all of us looking forward to it. And then as SpaceX and all are planning missions to Mars. So how does it all, what we are doing, ties to these big goals of the humanity?
Well, I think it's in this case, you kind of have to look at the common denominator here. So the common denominator is it's humans going into space, right? It's humanity going into space. And there are certain aspects of humanity that are going to be common across all of us, right? Now there is diversity and there are differences, but those are understood. But what we're trying to do with the Expand database and the Expand program is really set up a framework for not just the democratization of the data, making the data ingestion, the collection and ingestion as simplified as possible, to help lower the burden of just data acquisition, because I think that's going to be important as more populations go into space. Like the scale of humanity goes into space, it just needs to be easier to do so that we can just get that data back in so it can be useful. And then that data in turn is useful for the scientific community and for NASA and also the space the private spaceflight launch providers, right? Because they can best look at the pooled data set to understand, I'm looking at these individuals with this susceptibility or these pre-existing conditions. Can I look at who in the past has flown with these conditions and what did they experience? What were their outcomes? And so NASA has use for that information as well, because right now, as we talked about before these commercial spaceflight missions, the rate of government-sponsored public astronauts is very low, right? Like I said, only 625 individuals, so the N is not very high. And so what a program like Expand does is it helps scale the amount of data that could be relevant to spaceflight. And like I said, it's still human involved. So there's a lot of what we know about spaceflight that will be applicable to the general population as well as the astronaut core population. So that's what I think what we're going to bring to all the communities, not just the private sector, but also what the government sponsored programs are doing. I think they have risks that they're trying to manage. They have mission objectives that they're trying to maintain, and they only have so many resources to do it. And so if we can offload some of that, I think it would just add value to, like I said, hopefully the continued exploration and thriving of the human race in space.
Amazing. Chintan, any questions from the audience? Right. Out of time now. Yeah.
Okay, so let's see. So we have a question. Decentralized trials are difficult to perform on Earth. So what are the challenges researchers face while collecting data in space? So, maybe it's a two-part thing, maybe Jimmy, you want to go, and then maybe Kathy, you want to add, or Kim, you want to add about what challenges researchers face, I guess, so on Earth as well as in space. So.
Yeah, I guess I can start with this. I think the challenge is access to technology, right? So it's as I kind of described earlier in this webinar, you only have so much you can take into space just because of the size of the vehicle going and the available upmass to take what you want for a research trial, in addition to other the basic necessities like food, water, air, all those other things that you need to survive. That has to go with you as well. And then the next set of tiers is the science. And so I think the biggest challenge is just, do you have the appropriate equipment to collect the data you want? And I think a lot of that's been solved, not solved, but to the most part been solved for the home decentralized market, because at least a home is larger than a confined spacecraft. So your tolerance for the size and the weight of your devices is a little bit different than spaceflight. We are going to continue to miniaturize. We are continuing to make them smaller, and so that hopefully in turn maybe comes back to Earth and can be applied on Earth as well, to also continue to provide smaller devices and easier to use devices for Earth-based clinical trials.
Amazing. Kim, any challenges? Kathy, Kim?
I'll let Kathy go. She was going to say something.
I think it's similar to what you might say, which is that you need to have the devices be easy to use. You need to have a very easy procedure, and you have to have figured out what all the caveats are with that, so that you can avoid any problems, because you want good data. So quality data is a challenge.
Yeah. The only two things I will add are, for some reason, we're having issues finding good home health care people. So you're not going to send, maybe a nurse or doctor to space to perform something. But here on Earth, we can send nurses to patients' home to take bloods, to conduct more technical medical procedures. And we just don't have that infrastructure yet. So it's very hard to find good quality and reliable home healthcare groups to perform that. The other challenge is providing really complex services to our patients in their home, like cancer infusions, risky injectables that could lead to a bad reaction. You don't want to do that at home. You want to do that at your hospital where you have crash carts and a whole team of people to help patients if they have an adverse reaction. So that I think will be a perennial challenge.
Great point. Great point. Chintan, any other questions?
Yeah, so we touched on some of this, but what can we do to make participants more comfortable with technology? It's a general question.
I guess folks have touched upon it, but any further thoughts? Yeah.
We so at our endo department, we often use something called the CGM, continuous glucose monitor, and it's a device that is a little needle, sits right under the skin and monitors glucose levels every 3 to 5 minutes. And it takes some training and you have to insert it in yourself. It's like giving yourself a little shot. So we spend hours with our patients training them for the first time. They come back 2 weeks later and we retrain them. So it's, similar to any human learning a skill. It's, continual exposure, training, retraining, and reference guides that they can refer to refresh.
And I will kind of give a bit more of a sci-fi response. And then the state of the art on Earth is fantastic. But what we look for on the Trish side, and kind of like I said, we use space sort of as that forcing function to kind of advance and mature and continue to make technology just more and more accessible. Is at some point can we get to the point where a lot of these physiological data sets that we're collecting can be done on a non-invasive, so you don't have to even have a puncture. Can we find mechanisms that can collect or analyze glucose without having to do a blood draw? There are technologies, they're all very early stage right now, but the idea is with space flight, because of our need for, again, easier to use, smaller, lighter, passive, maybe as the populations of spaceflight increases, it may become easier to just let's kind of advance these technologies and invest in these technologies so that it's easier to do. And I don't have to keep flying all these devices to collect blood and then figure out how to dispose of the blood. I mean, there's all these issues, not even just with initial collection, right? So, humanity is messy. Like we're very messy individuals. And so how do we kind of put some order in that chaos? And maybe one of the ways is maybe find a kind of unconventional approaches to collecting a lot of these data sets. And so that's one thing that we look at it on the Trish side is to look for disruptive technologies that really bring us order of magnitude change in terms of mass, power, volume, ease of use, and then also lower the burden on the subject. So they, kind of answer some of the questions that brought up is just it empowers them. They actually want to participate because it's not a hassle. Things like that. I think that has downstream effects on Earth as well, getting people to just be compliant and not feel like, oh, I gotta do my blood glucose again. That's, I got to do it 3 times a day or whatever. Like if it's just something that's just done throughout the day and it's easy to use, they're more willing to do it.
Well, any concluding thoughts before we do a quick summary as the hour come to the conclusion of this? Kathy, anything else to add to how to make this all easier and smoother for everybody?
No, it's been a great discussion.
Well, summarizing all of this, folks, I think what's exciting to me is I think the constraint, to me, space offers constraints on all the things that Jimmy were describing in terms of space, the things you can carry, all the things that we take for granted here on Earth. And that constraint allows our imagination and our creativity to be at one of its best. I think constraint is a driver for amazing innovation. And that innovation then is a path to freedom for us to do research at home, at night, in the morning. We don't have to worry about it. And I think that's the exciting part for us, that if we today can help contribute towards that evolution in how these technologies develop, that from constraint drive to ultimate freedom of us being continuously be able to monitor ourselves, look at our health, click of a button, the data goes to some research database for research purposes. to me, that's the most exciting part of this journey. And I hope we can get there before we land on Mars. Before we land on Mars, we are able to have these little patches that are there on our bodies that can monitor our vitals, that can do some quick continuous blood monitoring, and can give us some alerts or things, that can sound like sci-fi, but it's almost there. It's within reach. Within 5 years, I think we should be able to come to that world where monitoring becomes much easier, much more accessible. And we can have 1 million people enroll in a study, not 4, 5, 6, or 100 or 1,000 that we are seeing in some of the DCTs. Chintan, anything else to conclude? But this was a fascinating discussion, and over to you, please.
Yeah, I'd like to just thank all of our panelists for that very engaging discussions. A lot of very interesting points that are brought up. And, so we'll look forward to discussing more. This is a space webinar series, DCT space webinar series. So we'll be doing more on the horizon. So please stay in touch, and we'll meet in the next webinar. Thank you, everyone.